Um, Welcome everyone to tonight's event titled Is Anti-Zionism Anti-Semitism? I'll now pass it on to our first panelist, who just happens to be the first on my screen. So we'll start with him. Joseph Cohen, you have 5 minutes to introduce yourself and what you think about the question of tonight's event.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for hosting me. Really looking forward to talking to the panelists. Clearly going to be an interesting conversation. So to know Jewish history is to understand oppression. Ever since European imperialists expelled my people from Israel 2,000 years ago, we've been dehumanized, tortured, and subject to genocide. You see, we existed as a perpetual minority in foreign lands, and these lands were not kind to us. We were always seen as the other, with no state, no army, and no means to defend ourselves. Our survival was dependent on the benevolence or malevolence of our non-Jewish rulers. Zionism liberated my people from this oppression, and therefore to oppose Zionism is to support the oppression of Jews. I'll repeat that. To oppose Zionism is to support the oppression of Jews, and history is my proof. When the inquisitors mounted my ancestors on racks, ripping their limbs apart, there was no Jewish state to save them. When the Almohad Caliphate massacred 100,000 Jews in North Africa, there was no Jewish state to save them. And when Hitler, Yamach Shemor, massacred 6 million of my people in Europe, there was no Jewish state to save them. Then something miraculous happened. The Zionist movement re-established the Jewish state, changing the destiny of my people and saving hundreds of thousands of Jews. This time, when the Arab world ethnically cleansed my people, spitting out 850,000 Jews, it was Israel that saved most of them. When life became unbearable for Soviet Jewry, it was Israel that saved many of them. Now, it's easy for middle-class Jews in Bristol, New York, and London to seek the end of the world's only Jewish state, as in this moment, they have no need for its safety. They sit on thrones of privilege, where the only persecution they likely experience is hurt feelings on social media. But should anti-Semitism become an existential threat for us in Britain, Israel will also offer them a place of refuge. If you support the existence of a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state, aka a two-state solution, I have some bad news for you. You're a Zionist. In contrast, anti-Zionism is opposition to the existence of Israel, the world's only Jewish state. No other nation's existence is questioned. There are over 80 Christian countries and 50 Muslim countries in the world. Yet it's the Jewish nation alone whose existence is questioned. Singling out the Jewish state is anti-Semitic. Now, critics will turn to history and claim Israel was born in sin. I disagree. But even if it were true, most nations are born in sin. Borders are carved with the sword. Take the US. America sits on the graves of millions of indigenous people that were exterminated, and the few that survive occupy the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. Yet there is no global movement calling for the destruction of America because of their treatment of the indigenous people. In almost every British university, there's a Palestinian society. In almost every city, there's a Palestine Solidarity campaign. This city, Bristol, even has a Palestine museum. Now, the national, and almost all of them calling for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state. Now, the national liberation of one people, the Jews, cannot come at the expense of another people, and it hasn't. Israel's first prime minister, Ben-Gurion, declared, in the Jewish state, Jews will not have any right that is denied to Arabs, Greeks, Armenians if they are residents and citizens of the state. Every citizen, Jewish, Arab, or any other, will be eligible to be elected to be president, prime minister, a justice of the High Court, or any other government office, important or minor. And this has happened. In Israel, Arab judges have sent Jewish prime ministers and Jewish presidents to jail. In contrast, right before Israel declared independence, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem proclaimed, I declare a holy war, my Muslim brothers. Murder the Jews, murder them all. Before launching a war against Israel, the General Secretary of the Arab League threatened, this will be a war of extermination, a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades. Did you catch that? While the Jews were talking equality for all, the Arab leaders were talking genocide. Remember, this is just a couple of years after the Holocaust, and many of the Jews they want to exterminate are Holocaust survivors. In some grotesque perversion of history, it is the Jews that are accused of ethnic cleansing, when today there are 2 million Israeli Arabs who have complete equality under the law. In contrast, there aren't any Palestinian Jews. When the Arab armies invaded Israel, they ethnically cleansed every Jew from the areas Palestinians control today. It gets worse. Article 6 of the Palestinian National Charter still denies Jews Palestinian citizenship. I'll repeat that. Jews were ethnically cleansed from Palestinian areas, while Arabs were granted total equality in the Jewish state. A Jewish state should not and did not come at the expense of the Arabs who also dwelled in the land. The self-determination of Jews is completely compatible with the self-determination of Palestinians. In fact, 45% of Palestinians are de facto Zionists as they support a two-state solution. But if you deny the self-determination of Jews, if you single us out and condemn us to a life of oppression under the boot of others, you are not an anti-Zionist, you are an anti-Semite. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks for keeping on time, almost. Joanna Phillips, you're next.
Great, thank you. I'd like to start again, just thank Izzy for inviting me here tonight. I'm really excited to have this discussion and hopefully generate some good conversations. I'll give a really brief bio of myself to give some understanding of where I'm coming from. I grew up involved in Jewish communal life through my Reform synagogue and my Zionist youth movement, BBYO. I love BBYO so much, I decided to go on a gap year to Israel with them when I was 18. And I came back from that sort of identifying as a liberal Zionist, but really shaken by things I'd seen, particularly when I went to the West Bank. I sort of started to understand what the occupation really means for Palestinians living there. A few things happened. I kind of started studying at university. I met some Jewish anarchists in a group called Jewdas. And slowly, about the course of a year, I learnt more and I began to change my views, and I started to identify as an anti-Zionist. Now, obviously, as an anti-Zionist, I don't think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I'm opposed to Zionism because I disagree strongly with all nationalism. And I think we can only have justice in the Middle East if we have states where your religion doesn't have any bearing on your rights or your experiences. But at the same time, I have seen and I do recognise that there can be anti-Semitism in pro-Palestine spaces. So I think to really answer this question, we first need to talk about how we understand anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is complicated. All oppression is complicated. These are things that are woven into our society from centuries ago, and learning them is really hard and painful. But I think what is important with anti-Semitism when we talk about it is that we understand that this is still a political topic, and how we understand anti-Semitism is going to depend on your ideology. You know, I'm a Marxist, I'm an anti-colonialist, and so my understanding of anti-Semitism sees a lot of things about, positioning Jews within capitalism and colonial states as these easy scapegoats that can be blamed when things go bad. Now, I don't imagine most of you, or even all of my fellow panelists, are going to share this view because, you're probably not all Marxists. That's, okay. But I think where too many people fall down, and this is relevant to the question we're getting at today, is that they don't take time to sort of develop this analysis and think about how does anti-Semitism fit into this wider question of society, and how does it interact with other forms of oppression that we see. And I think without this understanding, we can get into really reductive identity politics, where anti-Semitism becomes purely about what Jews feel. So I hear the statistic a lot that 90% of Jews are Zionists, and therefore being anti-Zionist is being anti-Jewish on some level. And I know that Zionism is an area where Jews feel strongly. I've had Jews tell me that they feel physically sick thinking about BDS, and that's the boycott movement against Israel. And like, I really have, you know, empathy. I understand how that feels growing up in like that, these Zionist spaces. But I think we do have to have a more structural understanding of anti-Semitism before it becomes hollow, especially because Jews are quite famous for having opposing opinions. What do you do when some Jews say something about Israel's all right and others say it's not? You can't just poll every Jew in the UK or in a university. So I think, you know, for anti-Semitism, where we have to start is understanding how our analysis of this is formed and why that might lead, you know, how that interacts with this question about Zionism. And finally, I'd just like to talk also about Palestinians, because I think this question has real impact for them too. And it's great that this is like an all Jewish panel. It's really cool that we're getting to talk about this like as Jews. But this question affects Palestinians. I take a particular problem here with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that many universities have adopted, which states an example that describing Zionism as a racist endeavor could be seen as anti-Semitic. Now, there's a caveat to this that, you know, if you apply it to all states, then like that's okay. But I've seen in action many pro-BDS and pro-Palestine events being shut down, citing this definition saying they're anti-Semitic. And I do think there's broadly two types of people in the pro-Palestine movement. There's those who can, like, you know, honestly talk about settler colonialism and white supremacy in Australia and the US, for example, and, you know, ethnic conflicts in Kashmir, and extend this analysis to Israel, see it in that global picture. And there's those who do project every ill in the world onto Israel to avoid having to talk about these like horrible things happening in the world. But too often we just get this assumption that every person on the left is in that former camp unless we prove otherwise, and unless we go with like this whole analysis, you know, of the world. And I think that's like ridiculous hoops to have to jump through. And also it denies Palestinians a voice to talk about their lives and experience. Like, you know, a Palestinian who says that in their experience it is racist, that in the West Bank they might live under a different law system to their Jewish, like, literal next door neighbour. I don't think they have to then, you know, come up with some global analysis to avoid being called an anti-Semite for stating the really basic facts of their life there. And so I think that's, for me, why it is really important that we take some time to understand what anti-Semitism is, understand like the threats it poses to Jews, and I think it does pose real threats to Jews in Britain, so that, you know, we don't have this curbing of free speech, especially in a way that harms another minority group. I'm not sure how I'm running to time. 5 minutes is definitely not long enough to go into this question in a substantial way, but I hope some of what I've said has given you some idea of where I'm approaching this question from, and really looking forward to digging into some substantial examples with my fellow panelists.
Thanks, Joanna, and I'm sure you'll have more time to go into the meat of this in the discussion section. Sabrina, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism?
Hi, I'm Sabrina. So I just wanted to again thank Izzy and the Free Speech Society for putting this event together, all the other panelists for agreeing to speak. I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction explaining who I am and my experience with both anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I'm then going to define both terms because I think we need to be really clear about what we're talking about. And I'm going to then explain my position and stance in this debate. So I know I gave a rather long introduction paragraph to Izzy, but I'm a Jewish student. I've had quite a lot of first-hand experience of anti-Semitism, frequently online, sometimes in person. I am a Zionist, and I'm going to quickly define what I mean by Zionism there, but I'm going to speak about that a bit more later. So when I say Zionism, I mean the right for Jewish self-determination in their ancestral homeland, i.e. Israel. And I'm someone who loves Israel. I have Israeli family. I've been there many times. I've traveled to settlements, been to East Jerusalem, and spoken to Israelis and Palestinians about their experiences. And I'm someone that's really concerned with the moral fibre of Israel. I like to see myself as a critical friend of Israel because I love it so much. I want it to be the best country that it can be. So I will so passionately criticize it and condemn settlements and racism and occupation and things that I think should change. But crucially, criticizing the actions of the Israeli government does not make me an anti-Zionist. I can be a Zionist who also criticizes Israel, and that's okay, and they're not mutually exclusive. So my position on this debate is as follows. I've developed the stance over many years of lived experience. It's a personal issue for so many, so I'm so much more interested in talking to people and hearing their lived experiences about this conflict in order to sort of develop my stance. Now, while Zionism does mean, by sort of any measure, the right for Jewish self-determination in their ancestral homeland, I don't believe anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism for the following reason. Zionism is one of those words that people project meanings onto. Though the Zionism I have just defined is the factually correct one, in my opinion, when people define themselves as anti-Zionist, more often than not, they are referring to a completely different idea of Zionism. I have heard a lot of people say, I don't support Zionism because I don't support Israel's right to harm civilians or bomb civilians. Now, I obviously don't support Israel's right to just do that either, yet I'm still a Zionist. I think the person who has said that has no understanding of the history of Zionism, but I don't think it's productive or fair for me to just call them an anti-Semite. I think it creates a really divisive discourse, especially when we're talking about two completely different ideas and have two very different associations with what Zionism is. Now, I do try and correct people and have conversations with them about the history of Zionism and what it means to sort of the Jewish narrative. But I do think the word Zionism has just been tainted in so many circles. Many no longer associate it with liberation, but rather associate it with the oppression of Palestinians. Now, I still think that the people that associate it with oppression are wrong and are misunderstanding the essence of Zionism. But calling them anti-Semites does little to achieve progress in this very divisive debate. I also think something that is really important and is often underestimated is the tone and the intention that we come into these discussions with and who you are. I think it's really important that people try and have productive discussions and they can ask challenging questions as long as they do it in the right way. However, I will say in the last 2 weeks, I've written 2 articles about anti-Semitism, one about Corbyn and one about a Bristol lecturer. I'm just going to read a few of the comments I received under this article. Some of them are quite rude. So one is, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Israel is a vicious apartheid state and any Jewish person with morals should see this. Any comment on the 18-year-old Palestinian who was beaten to death by Zionist terrorists yesterday? Love it when Nakba deniers and genocide apologists talk about being uncomfortable. My articles weren't about Israel and they weren't about Palestine, but people unquestionably hijack the struggle of the Palestinian people and use anti-Zionism to attack Jewish people. Lots of anti-Zionists I've come into contact with have been anti-Semitic to me, but lots also aren't. I think you have to take it case by case and be open-minded with these complicated discussions. Yeah.
Thanks, Sabrina. So far, you definitely win it on keeping to time. Dr. Ron Mandel, do you think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism? 5 minutes.
First of all, I want to thank the other 3 panelists for very provocative introductions. I've been taking notes. So I'll possibly be asking all 3 of them questions later. I think I need to start by quoting someone I've admired for a number of years. I heard him speak at the annual general meeting of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions in London in 2017. It was the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. I've subsequently invited him to speak at the last annual general meeting I chaired in Northampton for the Northampton Albeira Palestine Friendship Association. His name is Robert Cohen, and he has a blog called Writing from the Edge, which I highly recommend. He's an observant Jew from Manchester, and he wrote the following piece for the Jews for Justice for Palestinians. It's an organization I'm a member of as well, which I didn't put in my introduction, which Izzy read out earlier. It's just entitled an article called An Outsider in My Own Community. Now, the point I think he makes is a point that I think we all have to be sensitive to. As a former observant Jew, I'm so culturally Jewish. I don't observe the Sabbath anymore, although at one time I went to synagogue for 3 years consecutively, and I was quite religious as a Jew. This is what he has to say, and this is something I think we cannot deny, and I think we need to take this on board. Zionism and the state of Israel has become so central to Jewish thinking and identity that it has merged with Judaism itself, right across the spectrum, from liberal to orthodox. As a result, it is hard to be critical of Israel without being accused of being anti-Semitic. Now, I think I have to thank Sabrina earlier, because I think she made a distinction between being critical of Israel and being anti-Semitic, and I think that was very useful. What I want to do is spell out a bit in greater detail how I understand anti-Zionism to mean. Anti-Zionism could run the spectrum. It could be denying Israel established a Jewish homeland as a settler colonial project, recognizing that it displaced the indigenous people, the Palestinians. So it sees the creation of Israel, so to speak, as original sin, quote unquote. I hate to use that religious term, but I think it does incorporate that sentiment. Many anti-Zionists even go further, and this is the critique they will offer for contemporary Israel. And they see Israel as an apartheid state whose practices daily racism against Palestinians, and that's manifested in the establishment of a separation wall, the use of checkpoints, the capricious demolition of Palestinian homes, etc. But recognizing that anti-Zionism might take these two forms, there are other milder forms. Basically, I wouldn't call them anti-Zionism, but basically they position themselves as being very critical of the state of Israel. They see particularly Israel's existence post-1967 in the occupied territories as very problematic. Okay, this draws attention to Israeli government's policies, which they feel very uncomfortable with, and particularly because they find it incompatible. This is a point I want to make very strongly, very incompatible with Judaic ethical and moral principles. So there's a very strong tradition here among Jewish voices who feel that they cannot defend Israel as a Zionist state, and feel that they're compelled as Jews to speak out and be very critical of Israel. Lastly, and here I think hopefully most of the panelists will agree with me, anti-Zionism is not inherently anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean that those people who are anti-Zionists don't fall victim to anti-Semitism. Some are very sloppy with the language they use. They use tropes which are clearly anti-Semitic, talking about Jewish lobbies, Zionist conspiracies, the undue influence over Western governments. Those are anti-Semitic tropes. But I think by and large, anti-Zionism is not characterized by anti-Semitism. But I want to be balanced here, because I don't want to be taking an extreme position which argues that anti-Zionists are protected, so to speak, from anti-Semitism, because I think quite rightly we have to look at the context in which they campaign for Palestinian human rights. We have to be very careful to make sure that anti-Zionists do not fall into the trap of blaming the Jewish people and holding them collectively responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. Now, the other point I want to make, and I'll close on this point, as someone who, I came to this issue not from being critical of Israel. I came from it by looking at the Palestinian experience. But part of the difficulty we have is we kind of like have to choose sides. You know, either I'm for Israel or I'm for Palestine. All right. The Palestinians and Israelis live together. All right. They live in the state of Israel together. And before 1948, they lived together. All right. We have to recognize that part of the difficulty is the Palestinian narrative has been drowned out. All right. It has not been listened to. There's no opportunity, by and large, in our society to capture the Palestinian experience. I came to this issue before I moved to this country, all right, recognizing the injustice committed against Palestinians. It did not mean, all right, that I rejected Israel ipso facto, all right? I recognize that the impact of the Holocaust on the Jewish people collectively possibly justified their belief in a Jewish homeland. But it did not mean, all right, this is a critical point, that their self-determination had to be at the expense of the Palestinian people who were living in Palestine prior to 1948. So I think if we could build bridges, so to speak, in this panel to recognize that it's not either or, all right? Yes, we have to listen to Jewish voices, Israeli voices, but we also have to listen to Palestinian voices. I think we can go a long way in trying to establish a dialogue.
Thanks, Dr. Ron Mandel. I want to remind the audience that you can submit your questions to the panelists through slido.com using the event code #FSPanel, and I'll put that in the chat here. No, I can't put it right now. I'll put it in a moment. So slido.com #FSPanel, FS for free speech panel. And a reminder, this is both to the audience and to the panelists, that the question of tonight is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism? We're not discussing tonight the Israel-Palestine conflict itself, and particularly to the audience who submit questions, I will not select questions that are not linked to the question of tonight's topic and that are only about the Israel-Palestine conflict. All right, we have now 20 minutes for the panelists to discuss amongst themselves, and the way we're going to do it roughly, only as a rough guideline, is each panelist is given roughly 5 minutes during which they can ask their fellow panelists the questions they want to ask them. But I won't be strict on this, so if other panelists feel they want to come in on something a fellow panelist has said, please feel free to do so. But please, I want to make sure that each of the 4 panelists does get to ask questions of the other panelists. I won't do it in any order, so whichever of you wants to has a question they want to ask to someone else, feel free to go for it.
I'll jump straight in, being the only person who is definitively saying that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. And I particularly Ronald, because I think he focused on this more than any other, to address what I think is one of the weakest arguments which is used. Joanna also touched on it. And that is that there are Jews that are anti-Zionist. So anyone who is familiar with Jewish history will know that our history is littered with Jews who turned their back on their people and endangered us. So if you could turn to the Inquisition as an example, the Grand Inquisitor, who was responsible for the butchering, the torturing, some of the worst oppression the Jewish people have ever faced, was Thomas de Torquemada. And he was an anti-Semite, no if, buts, or maybe. He tried to force Jews to either convert to Christianity or identify those that had converted to Christianity and show how they were actually still secretly Jewish so they could be tortured and burnt alive and ripped apart on the rack. You have modern day people like David Cole, a Holocaust denier. You have an actual Nazi himself, a doctor, Hans Eppinger, who was responsible for performing horrific surgery on Jews in concentration camps. We've got some Marxists on the panel. Karl Marx himself wrote in the Jewish in his paper on the Jewish question, he wrote, "What is the worldly religion of the Jews? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money." It's an incredibly weak argument to say because a Jew is anti-Zionist, therefore they cannot be anti-Semitic. The reality is 95% or plus Jews in the world support the existence of the state of Israel. And if you are one of the fringe minorities that oppose its existence, then you are not representative. And I would argue you actually are anti-Semitic. It may not be your intention, but you put me, my family, my friends, my community at great risk. History has proven time and time again, our existence living under the rule of others has not fared well for us. We are dependent on the nations either coming to our defense or turning their backs on us. So in closing, I would just like to ask, how is, because you as a Jew, how strong an argument do you truly think it is to say that I as a Jew or my friends as Jews opposed to the state, the existence of a Jewish state, therefore we can't be anti-Semitic. I just don't understand the argument. It's not an argument. You can have black people who are racist against blacks. You can have women who are sexist against women. And you can have Jews who are anti-Semitic against the Jewish people.
Can I come in on this?
Ron and then Joanna.
Because I think Joseph referred to my comments, because I did take up this issue. I think you have to look at the context in which anti-Zionist views are being expressed. All right. I did say, all right, that some anti-Zionists, and this could be even Jews themselves, all right, fall into the trap of using tropes which were very easily interpreted as being anti-Semitic, in fact, are anti-Semitic. And I gave some examples. Okay. But I think what you're ignoring, Joseph, is that there's a whole growing movement, particularly among younger Jews in this country and the United States, many of them influenced by rabbis, okay, all right, who are principally taking a very critical position against Israel because they feel so uncomfortable as being practicing Jews in terms of the rabbis with their Jewish identity, their Jewish teachings, their moral and ethical code. I could cite numerous examples, and I possibly will in the conclusion. There are 2 books I would highly recommend, which I'm not going to do now, which actually draw out from Jews from all over the world, all right, who have become activists around the issue of Palestinian human rights, who are broken with Israel, all right? And it's not me that they're anti-Semitic at all, but they feel compelled as Jews, all right, to speak out against Israel. I don't think you can make a blanket statement saying that anti-Zionists are inherently anti-Semitic. I think that's a blanket statement, all right, and I think it's unjustified, and I think it does not do justice to the complexity of the issues that we're trying to discuss.
Very quickly, could you just...
Joseph, no, I want to give Joanna a chance to respond to your critiques of Marxism, or whatever she wants to respond to.
Thank you. Oh, Joseph, we were having such a nice evening, and then you compared me to like Nazis and inquisitors. You quoted some Marx at me. I'm not going to respond by quoting some of the things that Herzl, considered the founder of Zionism, to most people said about, Jews being like the sewage of Europe and things like that, because I don't think it's like that fair to put those comments on people. I think we can recognize that ideologies have complicated histories, and many of the founders of these living in prior times had some problematic opinions. I don't really know where you got that argument from anything I was saying. I have never said that the fact that some Jews are anti-Zionist means that that they can't be anti-Semitic. Yes, I did say on a personal level that it does kind of follow that as an anti-Zionist and a proud Jew, I'm probably not going to think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That would be like a strange thing. But I don't know that it doesn't logically hold up as an argument. But I think what's important here, and if I may return to it, is to talk about this is about how do we understand this issue of anti-Semitism. And like I said, we can't just put this to a poll. There are Jews out there who are horrible Holocaust deniers, and so I'd like this to come back to an actual grounded understanding of anti-Semitism as an analysis. It's quite strange actually being the left-wing person on this panel and arguing against identity politics, but I even spoke in my original thing about how I don't like these this 95% statistic of people supporting Israel. I have it at 90. We can split the difference and call it 92.5. But I don't claim that I represent the majority of Jews. I don't think I do. But I think that's not a strong enough argument to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic just because a lot of Jews do support the existence of the state of Israel. My sort of counter question to you, if I may, it feels that your argument here is that if you don't support your particular world view, which is that we should have states where one religion has special rights, and I know you've kind of argued that there is no difference between Jews and Arabs in Israel. I just can't accept that as a truth. You have things like the law of return, for example, which very explicitly states that you have different immigration rights to Israel based on whether you have a Jewish grandparent or not. That's not even to mention situations in the West Bank where you literally may live under, you will be under military law versus civil law, depending purely on your identity, whether you are a Jew or not. But to return to this question of anti-Semitism, it seems a really bold claim to say that unless you believe in ethno-nationalism, because that is what Zionism is an ethno-nationalism, that I don't know how else you could define it other than a nationalism that in some way believes that there is a state that needs to have some kind of Jewish character, that you're an anti-Semite. That's an awfully bold claim, because if we're going back to statistics, most people in the world are not ethno-nationalists.
Thanks, Joanna, for that response. I'm going to count this also as your question back towards Joseph. So I'm going to give Joseph some time to respond to that.
Perfect. Okay. Couple of things. First is just if Ron could, he mentioned that amongst young Jews, there's huge support for Israel. So very, very quickly, could you just provide your source stuff? Because I'll go to Yakad, who are probably the most left-wing, anti-settlement, pro-Palestinian Jewish movement in the UK. Their survey said that 90% of Jews in the UK support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. That survey was issued in 2015. And so is it anecdotal, or do you actually have some hard evidence of what you're saying, that there's a large movement of Jews that are anti the existence of the state of Israel today as a Jewish state? And to come back to the ethno-national, anarchist, internationalist question, it's a nice question, but it's a little duplicitous. So if you are an anarchist, let's say, and you are opposed to the existence of all states, mazel tov. Like, there's no reason why anybody should support borders. There's no reason. Like, it is an ideology, you're right. But anti-Zionism is not anarchism or anti-statism. Anti-Zionism is anti the existence of a Jewish state, not all states, a Jewish state. And so it's one of my favorite videos I ever made was at the Pal Expo, where an anarchist came up to me with Anarchists Against the War, advocating for a Palestinian state while saying he was an anarchist and against all states. And so it's this double, and I'm not saying that's what you hold at all, but it's this double standard, this singling out of the Jewish state, having a word that describes that. So talking of ethno-national states, actually there are many ethno-national states. You may not recognize them as ethno-national states, but you've got Latvia, Slovakia, South Korea, China. I could name dozens. You look around Israel, every state that borders Israel, every state that shares a border with a state that borders Israel has a Muslim majority, a very, very high Muslim majority. Saudi Arabia, 98% Muslim. Jordan, Libya, and Sudan, 97% Muslim. Egypt, 95%. Iraq, 6%. Syria, 87% pre-war. Probably now far fewer minorities in Syria than there was pre-war. Lebanon is actually the most diverse country in the Middle East. It has 57.7% Muslims, but it used to have a majority Christian population, which has been massively reduced. And the idea that you want to oppose ethno-nationalism or religious states, but you focus on the Jewish state is the issue. How many panels have you been on discussing Latvia, discussing Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Libya, Sudan, and the homogenous aspects of these? And in contrast, Israel has a larger ethnic minority than the UK. Those Arabs have complete equality. And Druze, Christians, Muslims, all of Israel's minorities have complete equality with the Jews. There is no right afforded to them, with the one exception you mentioned, which is immigration rights. There is no right denied to an Arab who's an actual citizen of Israel that is granted to a Jew. It's a fallacy. It's a false argument.
Joseph, I'm gonna have to stop you there. So we haven't heard from Sabrina yet, but I do want to give the chance for Ron and Joanna to briefly respond if they want to, and then Sabrina will hear your questions to the other panelists.
I did not. So you want to go first, Joanna?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so this is, a claim I do hear a lot from the Zionists. It comes up very frequently. Why are we always talking about Israel? Why aren't we talking about China? Why aren't we talking about Saudi Arabia? Firstly, I think it's quite strange that people, talk a lot about these things with clearly not much experience, actually, talking to leftists, being around on the left, because people do very much talk about these things. Why Israel? I'd like to actually return to a point, Joseph, that you mentioned at the very beginning, where you sort of talked about the US. The US is based on ethnic cleansing. Why is there no global movement calling for the end of the US? I would say because there's a global movement for Palestine, because to try and avoid it getting to the point of getting to where the US is, where there has been a much, much bigger, firstly, ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, and then a complete destruction of their heritage, all of these matters. The point is that we are not at that level yet in Israel, and there is a global movement that has been called by Palestinian civil society, that has called on people globally to take that up. And I think, to ignore this, to act as if Israel is some strange special, to act as if you don't understand why anyone would take on Israel as a special cause, I think really ignores this fact that it is unique in how much there is this, I would say, peaceful civil society resistance that can easily be picked up by global people. And so that is why I would say that it is not anti-Semitic to focus in on Israel.
Thanks, Joanna. Sorry, Ron, I do want to bring in Sabrina at this point, but we will have a chance to hear from you in a moment.
Hi, that was a really interesting discussion. It was really interesting to listen. I will just say, I do personally find it very frustrating and disingenuous when people sort of cite the small minority of Jewish people who do oppose Zionism as evidence that sort of a lot of Jews oppose Zionism. I personally believe Zionism and Judaism are sort of intrinsic. Like we say Lashana Haba Yerushalayim every Seder, it is intrinsic to most Jewish people's lives to have sort of to believe, to have for the state of Israel and for Zionism, and that is sort of represented by most diaspora Jews. My question, it was going to be addressed to all the panelists, if that's okay. If we sort of understand anti-Zionism to be the belief that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, surely that movement and that idea is redundant, because Israel does now exist. How do we move past this? It's not productive to just say that we don't want Israel to exist anymore, because it does. This has happened. What is the implication of modern anti-Zionism? Do you want the ethnic cleansing of the Jews that are currently in Israel? How can we be what's more productive than this, if that makes sense?
Can I hear from Dr. Ron Mandel first, please?
I don't know where to come in, because Sabrina is just put down a challenge to everyone in the panel. But I'm going to take up 2 points before I take up point. Joseph, I never said the majority of young Jews, all right, oppose Israel. I'm speaking particularly as someone from the United States, all right, where I do know, all right, from reading polls, reading variety of political literature, that the turning point was probably the war against Gaza in 2014. That became a springboard for groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, which are growing. I've been saying the majority of Jews, particularly in this country. Remember, I started out by reading Robert Cohen's, very sensitive observation, which we cannot deny, okay? Most Jews identify with the state of Israel, okay? They draw sustenance, they're proud of Israel, they're proud of their achievements, and so forth. I cannot deny that. But it's a growing wave, all right, of Jewish dissidents who are beginning to express their discomfort with the practices and the policies of the Israeli government. Doesn't make them necessarily, as I agree with Sabrina, it doesn't make them anti-Zionist, but some of them have gone deeper, all right, and done a great deal of reading, a great deal of critical thinking, and basically have adopted an anti-Zionist position, which I summarized earlier. Ethnic nationalism. All we have to look at, it's not just the state of Israel, okay? Look at India. Look at Myanmar. Those are ethnic national states, all right? You cannot deny that ethnic nationalism basically can be very oppressive. It can single out a particular minority group and target them for discrimination. There is an alternative to ethnic nationalism, that's called civic nationalism, which regardless of religion, ethnicity, nationality, you draw and you claim civic rights on an equal basis. Israel, I'm afraid, does not resemble civic nationalism, all right? It's an ethnic national state, for better or worse.
I want to, can I ask Joanna and Joseph if either of you wants to specifically answer to Sabrina's question? And the question in short was, can we go past those debates? Israel exists, what do we do now?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in, if I may, as someone who is an anti-Zionist. And thank you, Sabrina, for this question. I'm grateful for it because I think it allows me to clear up a misconception. You know, people say, oh, if you're calling for the end of Zionism, the end of Israel, are you calling for ethnic cleansing? Absolutely not. You know, I abhor ethnic cleansing. It's also important for people who support the Palestinian cause to recognise that, you know, I do see Israel as colonial, as a colonial state, but there is a slight difference in that Jews in Israel, it's not like, for example, the British in India, where there was a mother state to return to. I think any just solution to what happens in Israel needs to have, you know, to account for Jews still being there. So what does it mean to call for an end of Zionism, the end of Israel? For me, it's about structures. In what way does Israel exist? When we're talking here, we're talking about politics, we're talking about the apparatus of the state, we're talking about, you know, the government, the courts, the laws. So for me, the end of Zionism, the end of Israel, is about removing any type of laws, any type of mentions in the constitutions that in any way privilege one religion, one ethnic group above another.
Thank you. Joseph, can you make it very quick? Because I still want to hear if Ron has a question to the panelists.
Okay, I guess to me, it's not really to respond, it's just to reinforce. Israel exists. It defines itself as a Jewish state. There are dozens of other religious states, dozens of other states which have one ethnicity as central to them. And it is only the Jewish state that is repeatedly singled out and its existence put into question. And that is what makes it anti-Semitic. Historically, anti-Semitism has morphed through the ages. In Christendom, the worst thing that you could do, the worst thing that you could be, was anti-God. So what did the Jews do? The Jews killed God. In Islamic states, the worst, in the Khilafah, in the Caliphate, the worst thing you could do was speak ill of God or of the prophets. What did the Jews do? The Jews killed the prophets. In Nazi Germany, what was the worst thing you could be? It was scientific, it was it was subhuman, or it was communist and Bolshevik. Two charges that were lobbied at the Jews. In communist Russia, we've got to, I don't know, Ron, if you're a Marxist or not, but we've definitely got one Marxist on the panel. In Stalin's Russia, what were the Jews called? They were called Zionists or rootless cosmopolitans. Anti-Semitism changes, and the modern manifestation is the Jews as a collective. We're not targeted as individuals anymore. It's now that we're a collective and we have a state, we are targeted. The state of Israel exists, and it is Israel alone whose existence is questioned as a Jewish state. And so that's, I don't want to, I agree with what Sabrina, I think it's a great question, and I didn't hear the answer I wanted to hear, but that's fine.
Thanks, Joseph. Dr. Ron Mandel, your questions to the panelists.
I'm going to pick up on both Sabrina's and Joseph's very provocative question. I'm going to ask, why do you think Israel is targeted? Why is Israel, you think, subject to this criticism? Because I just want to explore more deeply about why you feel Israel is being singled out and targeted for criticism. Is it because inherent anti-Semitic tendencies among the population? Is it based on a misunderstanding of the situation? I'm just more curious about, you know, why do you see Israel being singled out? Because you said that a number of times, Joseph. And Sabrina, I think you touched on that as well.
I'm happy to. Oh,
Yeah, can we hear from Sabrina, please?
I'm happy to go first. So I think sometimes, it's dependent and situation by situation. I think sometimes people, legitimately criticize the Israeli government. I do. But again, I'd like to make a clear distinction that criticizing the Israeli government and the actions of the Israeli government does not make you an anti-Zionist. You can be both a Zionist and critical. I think that sometimes people put all of the problems onto Israel unfairly because they are anti-Semitic. And I think it ranges everywhere in between. I like to approach, when anyone criticizes Israel or supports Palestinian rights or anywhere in between, I like to be open-minded and listen to them and what they have to say and try and take individual case by case. But I do, so sometimes it's both and it's either. And that makes it really complicated and really hard to tread this topic and why there's so much divisive discourse on this issue.
Joseph, did you want to add anything? Or Joanna, indeed? Although I do think the question was directed towards Joseph and Sabrina.
Something, if possible, Izzy. So I think it's a good question. And I have my views on why it's targeted, and I'd like to share them with you. There's an elephant in the room that people are terrified to speak about when it comes to Israel. And it's different words in different languages. In Arabic, it's Al-Quds. In Hebrew, it's Yerushalayim. In English, it's Jerusalem. You have what is the most holy site in the world for Jews and most Christians. I don't know if some prefer the Vatican, but definitely for Jews and most Christians, Israel is the most important site in the world. For Muslims, it's the third holiest site. Haram al-Sharif, Qubbat al-Sakra, Masjid al-Aqsa, particularly Masjid al-Aqsa, are seen as very important to the Islamic faith. And if you look at the origins of the conflict, the language that was used at the very beginning, I think that is the telltale sign of, is there anti-Semitism? So I'm going to read a few quotes because I think quotes are great. You quoted our friend Robert Cohen, and Robert Cohen, by the way, refuses to debate to me or any of my friends. So it's great to at least be debating with him by proxy, Ron. So he's a nice guy. I like him, and it's good to hear him quoted. So I already quoted Haji Min al-Husseini. I declare a holy war, my Muslim brothers. Murder the Jews, murder them all. Let's go to another one. Azam Pasha. We've done Azam Pasha. Let's go to another Haji Min al-Husseini quote. Our fundamental condition for cooperating with Germany was a free hand to eradicate every last Jew from Palestine and the Arab world. I asked Hitler for an explicit undertaking to allow us to solve the Jewish problem in a manner befitting our national and racial aspirations and according to the scientific methods innovated by Germany in the handling of its Jews. The answer I got was, the Jews are yours. That's Haji Min al-Husseini talking to Hitler. Similarly, if you get, let's go to al-Assad, was the president of Syria, the father, not the son. Strike the enemy's settlements, turn them into dust, pave the Arab roads with the skulls of Jews. This is the language of anti-Semitism. So the catalyst for the conflict was the opposition to a Jewish state on what was then they perceived to be Muslim or Arab land. Through the generations that's evolved and mutated, there's a huge leftist movement which is opposed to the state of Israel. But if you look at the origins of leftist opposition to the state of Israel, it links back to this same, so you have movements like Baader Meinhof, you have leftist movements, terror cells, who collaborated and trained with Palestinian terror cells and persecuted Jews around the world. And so there's been an association with the left and I would say Islamist or Marxist terror groups amongst the Palestinians, and over the years that's evolved. Opposition to Israel tends to come from one of those two camps. It comes from Islamists, or I'd say a lot but larger than Islamists. Most Muslims don't support the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. That's changing now, alhamdulillah, Baruch Hashem, thanks to the Gulf states and the close relations we're now developing with many in the Arab world. But historically, that hasn't been the case. And the far left. The far left opposes Israel. It's opposed to Israel from pretty much day one. It goes back to the Cold War. It's a very complex question. But at the heart of all this, if you trace it back to its origin, which is the most important part, it's the language of those that launched the 48 war that gives away the anti-Semitic origins of hostility to the existence of a Jewish state in that region. And it's the religious component which means it isn't dropped.
Can I also just, are you finished, Joseph? Sorry.
Go for it, Sabrina.
It's a long one.
This was a separate point that I just thought of now, especially on campus. And this is kind of a weird thing to associate with a conflict. But I think on campus, the Israel-Palestine conflict and commenting on it and having a position on it is kind of in vogue. It's like quite a popular thing for people to talk about, especially because I don't think a lot of people have skin in the game, and therefore it's easy for them to criticize. And I think that's where a lot of, when I was speaking about how people project their understandings of Zionism without actually really knowing what they're talking about, I've personally experienced a lot of that on campus, where a lot of people want to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because they want to be engaged, and that's great, but they also don't know so much about it, and they just like to talk about it because it's like one of those popular, I don't want to say popular, that's the wrong wording, but one of those things that's brought up a lot because it's sort of in at the moment, weirdly enough. I don't want to the importance of the Palestinian rights can't be underestimated, but like for a lot of young people it's in.
100%. The Labour
Joseph, we don't have time. Well, I'll come back to you in a sec. Joanna or Ron, do you want to respond? And then we'll move on to question and answers. Sorry, Joseph.
I'll respond very quickly because I'm really interested to hear audience questions here as well. I think it's a shame to take something as complicated as the question of why do many people in the West care deeply about Israel and reduce it down to one singular story, as Joseph has done here. I think most people who study history or politics will understand that things do not have a single origin. They do not have a single explanation. I take Joseph's point, but I don't think we can reduce this question down to this one thing. I think we have to look at many things. Yes, we have to look at how Arab states have used the cause of Palestinians to distract from their domestic policies. Joseph brought up the fact that this is, a religious site. I think it's also true for, even just English Christians, maybe even English atheists. Jerusalem's a fascinating place. It's natural that they would have heard of it. There's that song Jerusalem, and be interested in what's going on there in a way they might not know so much about West Papua, for example. And yes, I think, Sabrina, you bring up this point about, it's popular on campus. Maybe it really is, it has become a topic that the left cares about for, I think, very complicated reasons. And I'd like to return to my earlier point that, it feels like a struggle that has been called for by the people living there, by the Palestinians, that there is an international solidarity call here, and the left has responded to that. So I think it's very complicated. Yes, I've acknowledged at the beginning people have different motivations for being anti-Zionist, and some people it is a deflection away from settler colonialism, white supremacy, conflicts other places in the world. But in my experience, most people on the left do have a sophisticated understanding of these issues.
Sorry, Izzy, I have to respond to that. I have to respond to two parts of that.
No, Joseph, I'm afraid we don't have time. I'm very sorry. Ron Mandel.
I'm going to defer to the audience because I'm sure they have a number of questions, and I think you heard enough from me for the time being.
Lovely. And I do, at this point, I do want to apologize to the audience. We have run over time, and I'm just discovering the difficulties with chairing a panel with four passionate voices. I do have to say, before I go to questions, that we are over an hour into the event, and the word Labour has not been mentioned, which I find incredulous in the same week that Jeremy Corbyn has been dismissed, suspended for allegations of anti-Semitism. I don't know how that has not been mentioned. It's not my place as the chair to ask the question, but nudge, nudge, please do submit that question, because I would like to hear what the panelists have to say about that. All right. The first question I have here, and a quick reminder, you can submit questions through slido.com using the hashtag, using the event hashtag FSPanel, so FS for free speech panel. The first question I have here, and the question's a bit ambiguous, but I'm going to leave it deliberately ambiguous for the panelists to answer. The question is, do we have a problem of nationalism? I don't know if the we is we as in the Jewish community, we as in society. I'm not sure what the question is, but I'll leave that open for the panelists. So the question is, do we have a problem of nationalism? Please keep your answer as brief as possible. And Joseph, since you were itching to go, you can go first.
I'm going to be really cheeky. Okay, so very quickly, 100 deaths a year in Israel last year. Yeah, 100 deaths, hundreds of thousands of people killed around the world. The obsession with Israel is anti-Semitic. Similarly, you mentioned, Joanna, that Israel is white supremacy. The majority of, first, Jews aren't white, but even if you were to say that Ashkenazi Jews are white, the majority of Israelis are from the Middle East and North Africa. So there, I just wanted to jump in. Sorry, Izzy, you're shaking your head.
Very cheeky. Can we have an answer to the question, please?
Nationalism.
No, not from someone else now.
That's a very good question. I think nationalism, until very recently, was seen as a progressive force, particularly as being a reaction to empire and colonialism. And so most national liberation movements actually were inspired by aspirations for nationhood and to be recognized as a people, to form their own nation state. But more recently, we're seeing different forms of nationalism, which are often misconstrued as populism or right-wing populism, which you could see, for example, in Brazil, United States, India, Myanmar. So that form of nationalism is much more exclusive and much more damaging to particular minority groups. So I think you have to look at it from a historical perspective. From an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist perspective, nationalism has been seen as progressive, but in other incarnations, so to speak, nationalism could be seen as very reactionary and very dangerous.
I'm happy to jump in here. I don't know if this is going to directly answer the question, but I don't see a problem with groups being able to self-determine. I support the establishment of a Palestinian state because I'm a Zionist, not in spite of it. I believe any group that wants to self-determine should have that right to do so. Both Jews should have the right to self-determine and have an Israel, and Palestinians should have the right to self-determine and have a Palestinian state, however that ends up manifesting. So I don't see self-determination and that form of nationalism as a problem, if that answers the question.
If I may, I'd like to pick up on this point of self-determination. I'm grateful for Sabrina bringing it up again, because it's something that was mentioned often at the beginning of this panel, was this question of self-determination, about supporting self-determination for everyone. I'd like to say, I am a believer in self-determination, and I'm a believer in self-determination outside the framework of nation states. And I think that that's like an important perspective to bring into this, that, I often get asked, why are you only denying Jews the right to self-determination? I think we've seen how well nation states have fared at bringing different groups self-determination, and I don't think they fared very well. For me, self-determination as a Jew is about fighting for my right to live freely as a Jew in Britain. To pick up, even one example, my mother converted under Reform auspices in the UK. That means that in Israel, I am not allowed to get married because the marriage is controlled by the Orthodox, and they would not recognize me as a Jew. To me, I have more self-determination as a Jew living in the UK than I would as a Jew living in Israel. If I can't even get married in Israel in a Jewish wedding, what kind of self-determination is that for me as a Jewish person? So I just like to sort of respond to that as a counter to these questions of nationalism, that for me, I think self-determination is much more beautiful, much more liberatory outside nation-state framework.
Thank you all for the answers to that question. We're going to move on to the next question. The question was submitted by Ben Sewell. Ben, if you can switch on your microphone and preferably your camera, and please ask your question.
Hi, I promised this question was actually submitted before Izzy asked people to, but my question was, do you think the move from the Labour Party to suspend Jeremy Corbyn was a positive move for Jewish people in the Labour Party specifically, and in UK politics as a whole?
Feel free to jump in, anyone who wants to respond to that.
You'll just mute me if I do.
Go for it, Joseph.
Okay, so Jeremy Corbyn has led the Labour Party into disrepute. He's led it to being the only party other than the BNP to be investigated by the EHRC for racism. So when you're in the company of actual Nazis, it raises questions. He wrote the foreword to a book which was by J.A. Hobbs, which basically it had a chapter called, I'm remembering this, I hopefully remember it correctly, imperialist, series getting involved, imperialist parasites. And in imperialist parasites, it described a peculiar race that are responsible for all the wars in the world. The international, basically, it was one of the most anti-Semitic things I've ever seen. He laid a wreath on the grave of a terrorist that was responsible for the castration of Jews, the murder of Jews. There is no shadow of a doubt that Jeremy Corbyn has led the Labour Party to a terrible place. And in the wake of the official watchdog describing certain activities as anti-Semitic, for him to then go and repeat that and say that the allegations of anti-Semitism were overstated, hopefully I'm remembering that correctly, don't want to get sued, but to say it was overstated is just doubling down. So irrespective of whether you think he's an anti-Semite or he's responsible for leading the party into disrepute, you're wrong, but either case, even if you disagree with that, the very fact that he responded to the government's anti-racism watchdog by repeating the trope is just, yeah, of course he deserved to be thrown out of the party. He's trashed a great party. I'm not a Marxist. I come from a line of Labour supporters.
Thanks, Joseph. Any of the other panelists? Ron?
First of all, I must declare I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I left in 1993 when they repealed Clause 4, and I never rejoined. But I think we have to distinguish between Jeremy Corbyn's right to express his views about the EHRC's report on anti-Semitism. First of all, he did not deny the existence of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. He expressed a view, which you might disagree with, that was overstated, all right, and something you cannot really disagree with. I don't see how anyone weaponized, all right, by his opponents within the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party to discredit his leadership. I don't think you can actually deny that, all right? And I have to say here, for the mainstream media, including The Guardian, which has a reputation of being very progressive and very liberal, also echoed that sentiment. So whether or not you believe Jeremy Corbyn misstated or misrepresented the EHRC or didn't respect their views, their findings, I think that's irrelevant. He expressed his views, all right, and those views, I think, cannot be seen as being anti-Semitic at all, and you cannot hold him to question about expressing his views in that way.
Sabrina, I saw you nodding disapprovingly.
I think I don't want to just sort of echo what Joseph said, but I pretty much agree with most of what he said. I think that Jeremy Corbyn's attempt to claim that the HRC was that the claims of anti-Semitism were overstated was really hurtful. I think what's happened to the Jewish MPs, how some of them had to leave because they couldn't handle the abuse, how the whole listening to my friends, I've never been a member of any political party, but listening to my friends that were Jewish friends, members of the Labour Party, what they had to go through. I personally am very happy Jeremy Corbyn's gone. I think Keir Starmer's made even for political reasons, Keir Starmer's made a very clear step to try and rid the party of anti-Semitism, to take a proper zero tolerance approach. And I think that's really needed to rebuild the trust with the Jewish community that's been the trust that was absolutely destroyed over the past 4 years. I think it's a really good thing that after he said that everything had been overstated, and I found it very hurtful, I think it was a good thing that he's gone.
Joanna, anything to add? You can plead the fifth if you like.
No, I mean, I'm also surprised Labour hasn't come up yet after writing a whole dissertation on anti-Semitism of the Labour Party. So unsurprisingly, I have many thoughts about it, but I'm going to keep this brief because I think this isn't particularly relevant to the question we're actually here to discuss, which is about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And most of the examples, most of the things that have happened in Labour have not been, at least directly, about Israel and Zionism. Certainly this thing about suspending Corbyn, the comments made on the day, this was not directly about Zionism. So I think I'll just briefly say that I think it was the wrong decision, especially because, again, it made anti-Semitism into more of a political football. That should have been a day about looking at the recommendations of this report, about seeing where the party could move forward and support its Jewish members and repair harm that it'd done. And instead, I think the decision to kick Corbyn out, it made it about factionalism. It made it about one man, when I think the report showed that this was a problem that extended far beyond any one person. This was about many structures and many people. So, no, I think it was a very negative development to suspend Corbyn from the party.
Thanks, Joanna. I want to move on to one more question, although I do believe that some panelists would like to respond. I'll explain in a moment what we'll do, because we are coming towards the end of the official session. Actually, I'll explain it now. So I don't want to overrun, because I don't want to keep people here if they need to go. So what we'll do is, we're going to have our final question now. We're going to have closing remarks afterwards. Then we will, those who need to leave can leave. We will keep, including the panelists, we will keep the session going though. So for those who do want to carry on to have this discussion, hear more questions, hear maybe more about this specific question, we will carry on. But the official event will be finished, just so to make sure that those who need to leave can leave. So we'll now have our final question. And this one is directed specifically towards Joanna. It's anonymous, so I'm going to read it out. Joanna, what were your findings from your research into how colonialism has influenced Jews' perceptions of anti-Semitism?
Great, I've got 16,000 words if you'd like me to send them over. No, not really. I feel like I'm rather put on the spot here to recall my own research. I'd say that there's multiple things. It's actually super fascinating. So a big thing I looked at is I think Britain used a lot of similar tactics in controlling the Jewish community as it did with other colonial groups, this sort of divide and conquer strategy. And I think the Jewish community really lent into this. So if you look at Jewish immigration to the UK, what you see is that the first wave of immigration was typically from the Sephardi community of sort of Spain, Portugal, North Africa. They tend to be merchants, they tend to be wealthier, more assimilated into British society. And then suddenly in Victorian era, you get this wave of Ashkenazi immigration from Eastern Europe, mostly being pogroms. Issues are very different. They're not assimilated, they're poor, they don't speak English, and the Sephardi community kind of freaks out. Particularly, you have to look at how rights are given to the Jewish community in Britain. It's not like in France, where there was mass emancipation. Rights are very much rolled out sort of in individual cases. You even have things like with voting, that in theory Jews couldn't vote, but in many individual cases Jews were powerful enough to get those rights. So I think the Sephardi kind of elites were very happy to collaborate with the British government in using structures like the Board of Deputies, for example, to really present themselves as the official Jews that the government should be speaking to, and that they're, being like, we've got this, we're going to control these Ashkenazim, and we're going to get them integrated. JFS, for example, the Jewish Free School, very much explicitly stated our mission is to assimilate these people, to stop them speaking the guttural language of Yiddish. And I think that's still something we can really see with these responses to Labour anti-Semitism, with the board being furious that, for example, Jeremy Corbyn went to a Jewdas Seder, constantly maintaining that the Labour Party could only go through the board. It's kind of interesting when the JLC got involved with that conversation. So that's a big one. The other one was this matter of Israel, which I personally see as a colonial state, and the way in which you look at the language that the Board of Deputy used, for example. I think it echoed a lot of these very colonial ideas. There was one statement the Board of Deputies put out where they said, how would Corbyn feel if there were hordes of Muslim terrorists trying to get into the UK? It's really like barbarians at the gates, languages that echoes a lot of traditional colonialism. I don't want to talk too long and bore you all, but hopefully that gives a sort of flavour of some of the things I found.
Thanks, Joanna. So I'm going to reiterate what we're going to do next. We're going to have closing remarks from the panelists, and I'm going to ask the panelists to keep it to roughly the minute mark so we can finish on 8:30. Following that, there is the audience and panelists can feel free to leave as the official event is over. However, we will be carrying on with those panelists who choose to remain and the audience who chooses to remain. The live stream will carry on, and we will carry on this lively discussion. I want to apologize. We didn't have more time during the main event for more question and answers, but following the closing statements, we will certainly hear more questions, and you can continue submitting them. So we're going to start with closing statements. I'm going to start with Dr. Ron Mandel this time. Roughly 1 minute on your closing remarks on this night's discussion.
I'm going to reiterate 2 points I made earlier, and I'm going to close with another reading from an excerpt from someone I deeply respect. To me, the key issue is Palestinian human rights. That's how I came interested in the whole issue of Israel and Palestine. If you look at why Palestinian human rights are being denied, it leads you to a critical perspective of Israel. I would refer people to a whole number of organizations which have been active around this issue. One is called NAMAD in this country, Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States, Jews for Justice for Palestinians. There are 2 books written from a very interesting perspective. One is called Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, which is interviews with 14 Jews, some of which worked at kibbutzes in Israel, some were very devout, observant Jews, and once arch Zionists. The other is called Beyond Tribal Loyalties, which includes interviews with people from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the UK, United States, and Israel. All these people now developed an anti-Zionist perspective for their own reasons. But I'm going to end, as I said earlier, with a reading. This is from Peter Beinart, the editor of Jewish Currents, which I subscribe to, a very interesting publication, which I would highly recommend. And this is what he has to say. Anti-Semitism is wrong because it is wrong to denigrate and dehumanize anyone, which means ultimately that any effort to fight anti-Semitism that contributes to the denigration and dehumanization of Palestinians is no fight against anti-Semitism at all. So I hope that last statement gives you some food for thought. Thank you for having me on the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Ron Mandel. Sabrina Miller, closing remarks.
Hi. I just wanted to thank everyone on the panel for what was a really amicable and interesting discussion. I think it is quite hard to sort of have these discussions in the way that we've had them, in a really productive way. I wanted to just, I guess, end by emphasizing the distinction between being a Zionist, as in believing the right for Israel to exist, and then criticizing the Israeli government, which are 2 very separate things. And I think personally, more Zionists need to be able and feel comfortable in sort of fighting for Palestinian rights, because I don't think they're mutually exclusive things. And I also think that, yeah, and I just wanted to thank everyone for the panel, and for Izzy and the Free Speech Society for organising.
Thanks, Sabrina. Joanna Phillips, closing remarks.
Yeah, I'd like to echo thanks to everyone. Looking forward to continuing this conversation. Amicable, I didn't super love being compared to a Nazi, but we can put that in the past now. I think I'd really like to echo the point I made at the beginning, that we can't answer this question without an understanding of anti-Semitism. I still maintain that I refuse to concede to a worldview that says that if you are not signed up to these this understanding of the world as being part of nationalist states, and this somehow makes you an anti-Semite. I would really encourage people here to read more about anti-Semitism. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a publication that sort of explores anti-Semitism from a left-wing perspective that I hope for some of you will be interesting. I think this is an issue where in the Free Speech Society, this has been an issue where free speech has been curtailed, and I think the best way to oppose that, whilst also protecting the rights of Jews, is just to learn more about anti-Semitism, about how it operates, and be curious and learn.
Thanks, Joanna, and I'm sure the audience will enjoy going to that link. Thank you for that link. Joseph, closing remarks.
Okay, so this isn't a debate on Palestinian rights. It's a debate about whether it's anti-Semitic to call for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state. We're one of the most persecuted people to have walked the earth. Removing our ability to not only self-determine, but to defend ourselves from oppression is anti-Semitic. my fellow panelists, or certainly Joanna and Ron, are advocating for a utopia. It's been tried before. In liberal Germany, it ended in the chimneys of Auschwitz. In Marxist Russia, it ended with rabbis sent to the gulags. It's a fantasy. In every generation, we were slaughtered. And in contrast to what's happened before and what they're proposing, Israel has already saved hundreds of thousands of Jews. Zionism should be a symbol of hope for all downtrodden people. The Jewish people were able to overcome their oppressors, to overcome the tyrants, to liberate themselves and free themselves from 2,000 years of oppression. And to oppose this, to advocate that the Jews should be a defenseless people with no means, a perpetual minority, an eternal minority under the land and under the foot of others, is indeed anti-Semitic. So yeah, looking forward to the continuation of the discussion. I would like to add, Joanna, one personal thing. I want to give an example of where I too disagree with the State of Israel. I think the State of Israel has no right to say who you can or cannot marry in the State of Israel. And I personally think it's an absolute tragedy that people go through the experiences that you're going through, and it's something that I would advocate against. I don't think it's any business of the state to interfere with who loves who and who marries who. It's a continuation of Ottoman laws, but I don't want to excuse why they're doing it. It was Ottoman, then British Mandate, then Israel adopted it. For me, it's indefensible. And so I would stand in solidarity with you there. I would also like to add, I didn't compare you to a Nazi. I gave examples of Nazis who were Jews to show that you could be anti-Semitic and Jewish. So yeah, looking forward to the continuation of the debate.
I want to thank all our panelists tonight, one by one, for coming. Sabrina Miller, Joanna Phillips, Joseph Cohen, Dr. Ron Mandel, thank you all very much. The audience can join me in applauding the panel members, either by switching on your mic so we can hear you applaud, or by doing the clap emoji, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And I'm sure, similar to the clap for NHS in houses across the country, we can hear now loud applause. I will, so as I said, what we'll do now is we'll finish the official event. I'll give 30 seconds for people to leave, because I don't want people to feel they're leaving in the middle of something. They're not. The event is finished. People can leave. We'll have 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, during which those who want to leave, including the panelists, can leave. After 30 seconds, we will resume the discussion, and we'll also remain live on Facebook. So I'll see you in 30 seconds time.
Before we continue, I'd like to say as well, big thanks to Izzy as well for doing most of the organising for this and chairing the discussion so well. It's been such an interesting night.